Tonight, the city lights spill across the glass walls of Adrian Hale's penthouse high above Manhattan, where silence usually rules the rooms like an invisible king. At this hour, most people in the building are asleep, but Adrian Hale, billionaire founder of the fastest-growing tech security firm in America, is still awake, standing alone behind a marble bar with a half-finished glass of bourbon in his hand. From the street 38 floors below, he probably looks untouchable, the kind of man whose name appears in financial magazines and quiet gossip columns, the man people assume has everything. But inside the penthouse tonight, the air feels strangely still, like something small and unexpected is about to happen. At the far end of the living room, a young woman moves quietly across the polished floor, gathering a few empty glasses left from an earlier meeting. Her name is Elena Ward, the newest maid hired to work inside Adrian Hale's carefully controlled world, and unlike the other staff members, she does not rush, does not avoid looking toward the man who technically owns the roof above her head. She simply works, calm and observant, like someone who understands that silence sometimes reveals more than conversation. Adrian notices her when she bends slightly to pick up the final glass resting near the edge of the bar. Their hands almost touch, and for a brief second the quiet rhythm of the room shifts. Most employees would apologize quickly and step away, but Elena pauses, lifting her eyes to meet his directly. Adrian is used to people lowering their gaze, especially employees, especially women, especially anyone who knows exactly how powerful he is. Yet Elena does not look away. The moment stretches quietly between them, filled with something difficult to name. Then she says something so soft it almost disappears beneath the distant sound of traffic far below the building. Once I get close, she whispers, I do not stop. Before Adrian fully processes the words, she gently reaches forward and pulls him half an inch closer, not aggressively, not desperately, just enough to erase the polite distance that normally exists between a billionaire and the woman cleaning his house. For Adrian Hale, a man famous for controlling every situation, the simplicity of that moment feels strangely disarming. He does not step back. He does not speak. Instead, he simply watches her, studying. The calm confidence in her expression, as if she understands something about him that no one else in this enormous apartment ever has. And right there, in the quiet glow of Manhattan lights, the first fragile crack appears in the emotional armor Adrian has worn since the day he decided trusting people was more dangerous than building empires. If you enjoy stories filled with slow-burning tension, quiet romance, and powerful men discovering emotions they thought they buried, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Because thousands of listeners around the United States fall asleep every night with these whispered stories playing softly in the background, and your city might appear in the next one. Now take a slow breath, lower the lights around you, and return with us to the moment when everything quietly began, when one unexpected whisper inside a silent penthouse started changing the life of a man who believed nothing could ever reach him. Let us go back to the man standing behind the marble bar, the man the world calls untouchable, and return to our main character, Adrian Hale, who at that exact moment still does not realize the quiet maid beside him is about to become the most dangerous and irresistible presence in his carefully ordered life before dawn ever reaches the windows of this towering Manhattan penthouse tonight, where silence listens closely to every breath they share in the dim golden light above the city skyline. Stretching miles across the dark Hudson River beyond the glass walls surrounding them both, like a quiet stage waiting for a story that refuses to remain ordinary tonight, 3 months before that quiet moment in the penthouse. Adrian Hale's life moved with the same precise rhythm every day, the kind of routine that looked impressive from the outside, but felt strangely hollow when the city finally went quiet at night. Every morning at 6:30 he woke up without an alarm, the pale light of Manhattan creeping through the massive glass walls of his bedroom, nearly 40 floors above the street. By 7 he was already reviewing financial reports on a tablet, while drinking black coffee that one of the house staff placed silently on the kitchen island. By 8 his driver waited downstairs beside a black sedan that carried him across the city to the headquarters of Hale Security Systems, the technology company he had built into a billion-dollar empire before his 33rd birthday. To the business world, Adrian Hale represented discipline, intelligence, and absolute control. Investors trusted him, journalists admired him, and competitors quietly feared him. Yet the private side of his life was much simpler and far more silent than people imagined. The penthouse itself was enormous, nearly 8,000 square feet of polished stone, steel, and glass overlooking the river and the glowing skyline of Lower Manhattan. It had a private gym, a library lined with darkwood shelves, and a dining table large enough to host 20 guests. Yet most evenings Adrian sat alone with a simple meal prepared by the kitchen staff and returned to work long after the city lights began to blur into midnight. The people who worked inside the apartment followed careful unspoken rules. Speak only when necessary. Move quietly. Never interrupt when the owner was thinking. Adrian never demanded these rules directly, but everyone understood them within the first week. For Adrian, the silence felt comfortable. Years earlier, he had learned that distance was the safest way to live. Trusting the wrong people had cost him more than money. It had cost him time, energy, and the last serious relationship he ever allowed into his life. After that public breakup, when tabloids suggested that his former girlfriend had been more interested in his company's shares than his company, Adrian quietly closed the door on anything that looked like emotional risk. Work became easier than people. Success became easier than affection. And so the penthouse continued running like a perfectly organized machine. Staff arrived, completed their responsibilities, and left without leaving much trace of their presence. That quiet balance changed on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon in early spring when the building management service recommended a new cleaning assistant after one of the long-time maids retired. The woman who arrived that day did not look especially remarkable at first glance. Elena Ward was 26 years old, with calm eyes, dark blonde hair tied neatly behind her head, and the composed posture of someone used to working carefully inside other people's homes. She carried a small folder of references and stood politely near the kitchen entrance while the house manager explained the responsibilities of the position. Adrian happened to be walking through the living room during that conversation, reviewing a message on his phone, when he noticed her standing there. Most new employees lowered their gaze immediately when they realized who he was. Elena did not. She simply nodded respectfully and offered a quiet greeting before returning her attention to the instructions she was receiving. The moment lasted less than 3 seconds, yet Adrian registered something unusual in it. There was no nervous energy in her voice, no attempt to impress him, and no trace of the cautious fear he normally sensed from strangers who knew his reputation. She seemed present, observant, and completely calm inside a home that made many people feel small. Adrian continued walking toward his office without commenting on the interaction, assuming it would fade into the background like countless other small details in his carefully managed life. But as the weeks passed, he began noticing small changes in the atmosphere of the penthouse. Changes so subtle that at first he wondered whether he was imagining them. The kitchen counters looked more organized in the mornings. A book he had left open in the library was gently closed with a thin leather bookmark placed between the pages. Once, after an unusually long workday, he discovered a cup of hot tea waiting quietly beside his laptop even though he had never asked for it. None of the staff members claimed responsibility when he mentioned these details to the house manager. The answer was always the same calm response. Someone probably thought it would help. Adrian accepted the explanation, yet he found himself occasionally glancing down the hallway toward the laundry room or the back staircase where Elena often worked, wondering why the silence inside his carefully ordered home suddenly felt different, almost warmer, as if an invisible presence had begun shifting the rhythm of his world in ways he had not yet learned how to measure. Over the following weeks, Adrian Hale began to recognize something he had not expected to notice inside his own home, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that could not easily be explained by schedules or staff routines. The penthouse still operated with the same polished efficiency, but small details kept drawing his attention in ways they never had before. One evening he returned from a 12-hour series of meetings downtown and walked through the main living room expecting the usual quiet. Emptiness. Instead, he noticed the soft scent of chamomile tea resting on the marble counter beside his laptop. The cup was warm, freshly prepared, placed exactly where his hand would naturally reach after sitting down. Adrian looked around the room, but no one was there. Moments later, the house manager passed through the hallway, and Adrian asked who had left the tea. The man shook his head politely, and said he would check with the staff, but the answer later came back uncertain. Someone must have thought you needed it, the manager explained. Adrian accepted the response with a quiet nod, yet he found himself thinking about it longer than he expected. The next morning, another small detail caught his attention. A stack of reports he had left open on the dining table the night before had been gently arranged into perfect alignment, with a simple silver pin placed across the top page, as if someone understood exactly where he would continue reading. These were not dramatic gestures. They were quiet observations translated into action. And gradually Adrian realized there was only one person in the house who seemed to move through the rooms with that particular calm awareness. Elena Ward worked mostly during the late afternoon and evening hours when many of the other staff members had already finished their tasks. Adrian began noticing her presence in the background of his routines, sometimes passing silently through the hallway carrying fresh linens, sometimes adjusting a small detail in the living room before disappearing again toward the service corridor near the kitchen. She never interrupted him, never asked unnecessary questions, and never behaved as though his wealth or reputation required any special performance from her. Instead, she moved through the penthouse like someone who simply understood the environment she was responsible for maintaining. That quiet confidence stood in sharp contrast to the invisible wall that usually existed between Adrian and the people who worked for him. The difference became especially clear one evening when a group of executives visited the penthouse after a successful contract negotiation. The conversation in the dining area grew loud with laughter and confident predictions about the future of the company. Adrian listened politely while pouring drinks, but his attention drifted toward the edge of the room where Elena was quietly removing empty glasses from a nearby table. One of the visiting investors noticed her and made a casual comment about the view from the apartment, joking that working here must feel like standing inside a luxury hotel every day. Most employees would have answered with a quick polite agreement, but Elena simply smiled gently and said that every home felt different depending on the people living inside it. The comment was simple, yet something about the calm certainty in her voice made Adrian glance toward her. She was not trying to impress the guests or challenge them. She was simply stating an observation as though she had spent enough time inside the penthouse to recognize the quiet rhythms of the place. Later that night, after the executives left, Adrian walked into the library expecting to find the room dark and empty. Instead, he saw Elena standing near the tall windows looking out over the glowing lines of traffic moving along the river highway nearly 40 floors below. When she noticed him, she stepped back immediately, apologizing for pausing there while finishing her cleaning tasks. Adrian told her it was fine and asked whether she enjoyed the view. Elena nodded and said the city always looked peaceful from that height, even when it was full of noise. Adrian studied her expression for a moment, realizing that she was the first employee in years who spoke to him with calm honesty rather than cautious politeness. The conversation lasted less than a minute before she quietly returned to her work, but the encounter lingered in Adrian's thoughts long after the room fell silent again. For a man who had carefully designed every part of his life to remain controlled and predictable, the simple presence of one observant maid was beginning to introduce something unfamiliar into the structure of his days. It was not disruption exactly. It was more like a quiet question slowly forming in the background of his thoughts, a question about why the atmosphere of his home felt subtly different whenever Elena Ward moved through its rooms with the steady confidence of someone who seemed to see far more than she ever said aloud. By the time early summer arrived in Manhattan, the quiet pattern inside Adrian Hale's penthouse had settled into something strangely balanced, as if the enormous apartment had developed a second rhythm beneath its usual polished routine. Adrian still worked the same demanding schedule, still spent long hours building the future of Hale security systems, yet the moments he spent inside his own home began to feel less mechanical than before. He could not explain exactly when the change began, but he noticed that certain small details now drew his attention more quickly than quarterly revenue charts or investor messages. Sometimes it was the faint sound of footsteps moving calmly along the hallway near the service entrance. Sometimes it was the way the evening sunlight reflected off the glass walls, while someone quietly adjusted the curtains to soften the glare on his desk. Those movements almost always belonged to Elena Ward. Unlike the other employees, she seemed to move through the penthouse with quiet awareness rather than routine habit, as though she understood how each room felt at different hours of the day. Adrian rarely spoke to her directly, yet he found himself aware of her presence more often than he expected. The moment that finally shifted everything happened on a Thursday night near the end of June after an unusually exhausting week of negotiations. Adrian returned home later than usual, close to 11:30 in the evening, with the city still glowing outside but the interior of the apartment almost completely silent. Most of the staff had already finished their shifts. Only a few dim lights remained on near the living room and kitchen. Adrian loosened his tie and walked slowly toward the bar near the glass wall overlooking the Hudson River. His shoulders carried the weight of 14 straight hours of work, and the quiet apartment felt larger than ever. He poured a small glass of bourbon and stood there looking out at the distant headlights moving along the highway like slow streams of light. Behind him, the soft sound of movement came from the hallway. Elena stepped into the room carrying a small tray with 2 empty glasses she had just collected from the dining area. She paused when she noticed Adrian standing there, clearly not expecting him to still be awake. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Adrian simply nodded once in acknowledgement before turning back toward the window. Elena continued walking toward the kitchen, but as she passed near the bar, the sleeve of her uniform brushed lightly against his arm. The contact was accidental, barely noticeable, yet it caused both of them to stop at the same moment. Elena turned slightly, clearly ready to apologize, but Adrian surprised himself by speaking first. He asked whether she usually worked this late. Elena answered calmly that she sometimes finished the final cleaning after evening meetings because it was easier to organize the rooms once guests had left. Her voice carried the same quiet steadiness he had come to recognize. Adrian studied her expression for a second longer than necessary, noticing again that she did not seem intimidated by his presence. The city lights reflected softly in the glass behind them, filling the room with a low golden glow. Elena placed the tray gently on the counter beside him, intending to return to the hallway, but something about the closeness of the moment seemed to slow her movement. The space between them had become unexpectedly narrow. Adrian realized he could hear the faint rhythm of her breathing in the quiet room. Normally, he would have stepped back immediately to restore the comfortable distance that defined his interactions with employees, but this time he remained still. Elena looked up at him again, her calm eyes holding his attention in a way that felt both simple and strangely powerful. Then she said something so softly it almost blended with the distant sound of traffic outside the building. "Once I get close," she murmured, "I do not stop." Before Adrian fully understood the meaning of the words, she lifted one hand and gently drew him half a step nearer, not in a dramatic gesture, but in a quiet movement that erased the last polite inch of space between them. The action lasted less than a second, yet the effect felt enormous inside Adrian's carefully controlled world. No one had ever crossed that invisible line with such calm certainty. Adrian did not move away. Instead, he stood there in silence, realizing that the small shift in distance had changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Elena released his sleeve almost immediately, as though the moment had simply proven a quiet point rather than demanded an answer. She picked up the tray again and continued toward the kitchen without another word, leaving Adrian standing alone beside the bar with the glass of bourbon untouched in his hand and a single unfamiliar thought echoing through his mind. The sudden awareness that something inside the carefully ordered structure of his life had just moved in a direction he could not easily predict. After that quiet moment beside the marble bar, the rhythm of the penthouse shifted in ways Adrian Hale could not easily explain, although nothing dramatic appeared to change on the surface. The next morning began like any other day. The skyline outside the glass walls glowed with pale sunlight, the city already awake with the steady movement of taxis and early commuters. Adrian followed his usual routine, reviewing company reports while finishing his first cup of coffee. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, the memory of the previous night lingered with unusual clarity. He could still hear Elena's calm voice and feel the subtle movement when she had drawn him half a step closer. It had been such a small gesture, almost insignificant, but the quiet confidence behind it had unsettled the careful distance he normally maintained with everyone around him. At the office, his schedule filled every hour with meetings and negotiations, but several times his attention drifted unexpectedly toward the thought of the woman who moved silently through the rooms of his home. Adrian told himself the moment meant nothing. Elena had likely forgotten it already. Employees often behaved naturally when they believed they were alone with him, and he had probably read too much meaning into a casual remark spoken in a quiet room. Yet when he returned to the penthouse that evening, he found himself noticing details he had never considered important before. The living room looked the same as always, the furniture arranged with precise symmetry, the city lights reflecting softly across the glass walls. But Adrian's attention moved immediately toward the hallway where Elena often appeared at the end of her shift. For a brief moment, he wondered whether she would behave differently after what had happened. Instead, the night unfolded with the same calm routine as every other evening. Elena worked quietly along the far side of the room, organizing a stack of clean linens near the staircase. When Adrian passed through the living area, she offered a polite nod. Nothing more, her expression composed and professional. The simplicity of her reaction somehow unsettled him more than if she had shown embarrassment. It was as if the moment they had shared beside the bar had simply become another quiet observation in her mind rather than something complicated or dramatic. Over the next several days, Adrian noticed that Elena continued moving through the apartment with the same quiet attentiveness as before, yet now there were occasional moments when their paths crossed more often than coincidence would normally allow. One evening, she entered the library just as he finished a conference call. Another afternoon, she appeared in the kitchen at the exact moment he stepped inside to refill his coffee mug. None of these encounters lasted longer than a few seconds, but Adrian sensed a subtle awareness between them that had not existed before. The turning point came a week later during a small business reception Adrian hosted inside the penthouse for several investors visiting from California. The gathering was informal, with a few guests standing near the windows discussing technology markets while soft music played in the background. Elena moved quietly through the room, collecting empty glasses from a small table near the sofa. Adrian was speaking with one of the visiting executives when he noticed a tall guest leaning toward Elena with casual curiosity, asking her how long she had worked in such an impressive home. The man's tone was friendly but slightly familiar in the way people sometimes spoke to employees they assumed would remain invisible in the background. Elena answered politely that she had only been working there a few months. The guest smiled and continued the conversation, clearly enjoying the view from the penthouse, while making light remarks about how lucky she must feel to see Manhattan from that height every day. Adrian tried to continue listening to the business discussion beside him, yet his attention drifted toward the quiet exchange happening a few feet away. Something about the scene stirred an unfamiliar tension in his chest, a feeling he rarely experienced in professional settings. When the guest casually placed a hand on the back of a nearby chair while speaking with Elena, leaning slightly closer to emphasize a joke, Adrian stepped forward almost instinctively. His voice interrupted the conversation with calm authority as he thanked the man for attending the event and gently redirected him toward another group of investors near the balcony doors. The shift happened smoothly enough that most guests barely noticed, but Elena's eyes lifted toward Adrian with a faint expression of curiosity. For the first time since that night beside the bar, neither of them looked away immediately. The moment lasted only a second before Elena quietly continued her work, yet Adrian realized something unsettling about his own reaction. Protecting the atmosphere of the gathering had been reasonable, but the sudden impulse to intervene had come from somewhere deeper than simple courtesy. As the evening continued and the investors returned to their discussions, Adrian found himself standing near the window watching the city lights shimmer across the Hudson River while a quiet realization settled into his thoughts. The growing awareness that Elena Ward was no longer simply an employee moving through the background of his life, and that the subtle tension forming between them was beginning to shape his decisions in ways he had not yet learned how to control. The reception ended later than expected that night, and by the time the final guest stepped into the elevator, the city outside the glass walls had settled into the deep quiet that usually arrives after midnight in Lower Manhattan. Adrian Hale remained standing near the wide window overlooking the Hudson River, watching the distant lines of traffic glide slowly along the dark highway like soft streams of light. The apartment behind him gradually returned to silence as the remaining staff finished clearing the last glasses from the living room. Normally, Adrian would retreat directly to his office or bedroom once a gathering ended, But tonight he lingered beside the window longer than usual, replaying the small moment earlier when he had stepped between Elena and the visiting investor. The reaction had surprised him even more than it had surprised her. Adrian had spent most of his adult life maintaining careful emotional distance from people around him, especially inside his personal space. Yet the impulse to redirect that conversation had arrived instantly, without calculation or strategy, as if protecting Elena from unnecessary attention had felt more natural than ignoring the situation. Behind him, the quiet sound of movement returned as Elena entered the living room carrying a folded cloth and a small tray. She began collecting the last empty glasses from the side table near the sofa, working with the same steady calm that had first drawn Adrian's attention months earlier. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds in the apartment were the soft clink of glass against the tray and the distant hum of traffic far below the building. Eventually, Elena walked toward the kitchen entrance, but when she reached the marble bar, she paused briefly, noticing Adrian still standing near the window. The reflection of the city lights surrounded him in the glass like a distant constellation. Elena hesitated for a moment before speaking in her usual quiet voice. She thanked him for helping redirect the guest earlier during the reception. Adrian turned slightly, surprised that she had noticed his intervention at all. He answered simply that the investor had been drinking too much and talking too loudly for the atmosphere of the evening. Elena listened to the explanation with a thoughtful expression, then placed the tray gently on the counter. For a second, she seemed to consider whether to say anything more. Finally, she spoke again, her tone calm but direct. She said that people often assumed employees inside wealthy homes did not notice when someone stepped forward on their behalf. Adrian studied her face, recognizing the same quiet confidence that had unsettled him beside the bar days earlier. He told her that managing uncomfortable situations was simply part of hosting business guests. Elena nodded slightly, but did not move away immediately. Instead, she looked toward the wide windows and the distant glow of Manhattan beyond them. She said the city always looked peaceful from that height, even on nights when many people were arguing or negotiating below. Adrian followed her gaze toward the skyline, realizing that he had heard a similar observation from her once before in the library weeks earlier. The calm simplicity of her words carried no hidden agenda, yet they lingered in the quiet air between them. After a moment, Elena picked up the tray again and prepared to continue toward the kitchen. As she passed beside Adrian, he spoke without fully planning the question. He asked whether the investor had made her uncomfortable during the conversation. Elena stopped walking and turned slightly, clearly surprised that he had asked. For a moment, she seemed to weigh her answer carefully. Then she said that the man had not done anything truly inappropriate, but sometimes people spoke differently when they believed a person's role made them invisible. Adrian absorbed the comment in silence, recognizing the quiet truth behind it. Elena gave a small respectful nod and resumed walking toward the hallway. Yet, just before she disappeared from the room, she paused again and glanced back toward him. Her expression carried a thoughtful curiosity that Adrian had come to recognize over the past weeks. She said softly that not many people in powerful positions noticed those small moments. Adrian did not respond immediately. The apartment fell quiet again as Elena continued down the corridor and the sound of her footsteps faded into the distance. Standing alone beside the window, Adrian watched the reflection of the city lights shimmer across the glass while an unfamiliar awareness settled slowly in his thoughts. The connection forming between him and the quiet Maid moving through his home had begun as a subtle curiosity, but tonight he realized it was evolving into something deeper and far more complicated than simple observation, something that might eventually require a decision he had spent years carefully avoiding. In the days following the reception, the atmosphere inside Adrian Hale's penthouse changed in a way that was almost impossible to measure, but impossible to ignore. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. The staff continued their routines, the rooms remained spotless, and the city beyond the glass walls moved through its usual rhythm of restless energy. Yet Adrian found himself noticing Elena Ward more often than before, not because she tried to attract attention, but because the quiet awareness between them had become impossible to pretend did not exist. Several mornings he left for the office earlier than usual, yet somehow he would still pass Elena in the hallway carrying fresh linens toward the laundry room. Their exchanges remained simple and professional, a polite greeting, a brief nod, nothing that would appear unusual to anyone else inside the apartment. But each time their eyes met, there was a silent recognition that lingered a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Adrian tried to dismiss the feeling by focusing on his company. The summer quarter had become the most demanding period in the history of Hale security systems. New contracts were expanding the company into international markets, and investors expected Adrian to remain fully focused on growth. For most people, success at that level required complete discipline, and Adrian had always considered discipline his greatest strength. Yet even during long meetings downtown, he occasionally found his thoughts drifting towards something far less logical, the quiet curiosity about the woman who moved through the background of his life with such calm confidence. One evening, he returned home earlier than expected after a conference call with partners in California ended ahead of schedule. The sun was still setting across the Hudson River, filling the living room with warm gold light that stretched across the polished floor. As Adrian stepped through the front entrance, he heard voices coming from the hallway near the service kitchen. He slowed his pace instinctively, not intending to listen but recognizing Elena's voice among the conversation. She was speaking with another member of the staff, the senior house manager who coordinated the apartment schedules. The man sounded uneasy, explaining that rumors sometimes traveled quickly through private buildings where wealthy residents hosted frequent events. Adrian remained still for a moment, hearing Elena ask quietly what kind of rumors he meant. The manager hesitated before answering that some people in the building had begun speculating about the unusual amount of time the owner of the penthouse seemed to spend speaking with one particular employee. The words were spoken carefully, but their meaning was unmistakable. Elena remained silent for several seconds before responding with calm composure. She said she understood how easily misunderstandings could appear in places where people rarely looked beyond surface impressions. The manager suggested that it might be safer for everyone if she limited direct interactions with Adrian whenever possible. Elena thanked him politely for the advice, though her tone carried a hint of thoughtful distance. Adrian stepped away from the hallway before the conversation could continue, not wanting to create the impression that he had been listening. Yet the brief exchange stayed with him as he walked into the living room. For the first time, he considered how easily the quiet tension forming between them could become a problem for someone whose position inside the apartment depended on discretion. Later that evening, Elena entered the room to straighten a stack of magazines on the coffee table. When she noticed Adrian sitting near the window, she paused respectfully, clearly aware of the careful distance that normally existed between employer and employee. Adrian studied her expression for a moment before speaking. He told her he had come home earlier than expected and apologized if his presence made the staff uncomfortable during their routines. Elena seemed surprised by the comment, but shook her head gently. She said the apartment always adjusted to whatever schedule its owner kept. Adrian watched her finish arranging the table before she prepared to leave the room. Just as she reached the hallway, he asked whether she ever regretted accepting the position in such a public environment, where people might easily form incorrect assumptions. Elena turned back toward him slowly, considering the question with the same thoughtful calm he had come to recognize. After a moment, she answered that people often created stories when they did not understand what they were observing. Then she added quietly that the important thing was deciding which stories deserved to be ignored and which ones revealed something true beneath the surface. Adrian absorbed the words in silence as Elena continued down the corridor and disappeared from view. Standing alone in the fading evening light, he realized that the rumors circulating quietly through the building were only the first sign of how complicated this connection might become if neither of them chose to step back from the invisible line they had already begun to cross. The quiet rumor that Adrian had overheard in the hallway did not disappear as quickly as he hoped. Over the next several days, the atmosphere inside the penthouse remained outwardly calm. Yet Adrian sensed a subtle tension moving through the staff in small ways that most people would not notice. Conversations stopped slightly faster when he entered a room. The house manager seemed unusually careful about scheduling shifts so that fewer employees worked late in the evening. Nothing about the situation felt dramatic, but the invisible awareness that people were watching and forming opinions had begun to settle over the apartment like a thin layer of fog. Adrian told himself the simplest solution would be distance. He had spent years mastering the ability to step away from complications before they disrupted his life, and logic suggested this situation required exactly the same discipline. If he avoided unnecessary interaction with Elena Ward, the quiet speculation inside the building would eventually fade into something else. For 2 days he followed that plan carefully. When he returned home from the office, he went directly to his study instead of passing through the living room, where the staff usually finished their evening tasks. If Elena appeared in the hallway, he acknowledged her with the same polite nod he offered every employee, nothing more. From the outside, his behavior looked completely normal. Yet inside, Adrian felt an unfamiliar frustration building slowly beneath the surface of his calm routine. The reason became clear one late evening when he finished reviewing a set of contracts and walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water. The apartment was almost silent. As he entered the hallway, he noticed the door of the small storage room near the laundry area standing half open. A soft light glowed from inside. Adrian slowed his pace and saw Elena sitting quietly at the small table used by the staff during their breaks. She was reading from a worn paperback book, her expression thoughtful as though the story held her complete attention. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and immediately set the book aside, preparing to stand as employees normally did when the owner entered the room. Adrian raised one hand gently to stop her. He told her she did not need to interrupt her break. Elena hesitated before sitting back down, though her posture remained respectful. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet room felt oddly separate from the rest of the penthouse, a small space where the complicated expectations of their roles seemed less defined. Adrian noticed the title of the book resting on the table and asked whether she enjoyed reading during her breaks. Elena nodded and said stories helped her slow down after long evenings of work. Adrian studied the worn pages and realized the book looked like something that had been read many times before. Elena followed his gaze and explained that it had belonged to her father, who used to read it aloud when she was young. The simple honesty of the comment surprised Adrian slightly. Most employees avoided sharing personal details with him, yet Elena spoke without hesitation, as though she trusted the moment to remain uncomplicated. Adrian asked what the story was about. Elena thought for a moment before answering that it was about people learning that the choices they made when life became difficult often revealed who they truly were. The quiet seriousness of the description lingered in the air between them. Adrian leaned lightly against the doorway, realizing that the conversation felt strangely natural despite the rumors now circulating through the building. After a few seconds, Elena closed the book and stood up again, clearly aware that their brief conversation might already have lasted longer than professional boundaries allowed. She said she should return to finishing the cleaning tasks for the night. Adrian nodded slowly, but did not move away from the doorway. Instead, he said something that surprised even him. He told her that the rumors spreading through the building were unfair to her position, and that if the situation became uncomfortable, she could speak with the house manager about adjusting her schedule. Elena watched him carefully as he spoke. When he finished, she shook her head gently and said that she understood how easily people created stories when they saw something they did not understand. Then she added quietly that sometimes stepping away from a story only made others believe it was true. Adrian absorbed the words in silence. Elena offered a small respectful nod before walking past him into the hallway and disappearing toward the kitchen. Adrian remained standing in the doorway of the small room long after she left, staring at the closed book resting on the table and realizing that the simple choice he had been avoiding was no longer theoretical. The rumors outside might fade with time, but the quiet connection forming between him and Elena Ward had reached a point where continuing to pretend nothing existed between them would require a kind of distance that suddenly felt far more difficult than he had expected. For the rest of that night, Adrian Hale did not immediately return to his study or his bedroom. Instead, he remained in the quiet hallway outside the small staff break room, looking at the simple wooden table where Elena's worn book still rested. The apartment around him had fallen into the deep calm that only arrived after midnight, when the distant sounds of Manhattan softened into a steady hum far below the glass walls of the building. Normally, Adrian valued that silence because it allowed him to think clearly about business strategies, contracts, and the next expansion of his company. Tonight, the silence carried a different weight. The quiet conversation he had just shared with Elena lingered in his thoughts with surprising clarity. He understood the risk more clearly now than ever before. Rumors inside a luxury residential tower traveled faster than official statements. And if the situation continued to attract attention, the consequences would not fall equally on both of them. Adrian could survive speculation without difficulty. Elena, however, worked inside a world where reputation and discretion shaped every opportunity. Standing there in the hallway, he realized that the decision he had avoided for weeks could not remain unresolved much longer. The following morning, Adrian woke earlier than usual, long before sunrise colored the sky above the Hudson River. The penthouse still slept quietly while he moved through the living room toward the office where he normally reviewed the first messages of the day. Instead of opening his laptop, he sat beside the wide window and watched the pale light slowly spread across the water. For a man who had built a billion-dollar company through decisive action, the simple question in front of him felt strangely personal. Was distance truly the responsible choice, or was distance simply another form of fear disguised as discipline? Hours later, when the staff began arriving for their morning routines, Adrian made a decision that surprised even him. He asked the house manager to arrange a short meeting in the afternoon with Elena Ward in the small office near the service entrance. The request created quiet curiosity among the staff, but no one questioned it directly. When the time arrived, Elena stepped into the office with her usual composed posture, clearly unsure what kind of conversation awaited her. Adrian remained standing beside the desk rather than sitting behind it. He explained calmly that the rumors circulating in the building had reached him and that he did not want those stories to harm her position. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful but calm. Adrian continued by saying that he respected the professionalism she had shown since the day she began working there, and because of that respect he had decided to offer her a different opportunity. He handed her a thin folder containing a proposal for a new administrative position within Hale Security Systems, one that included training, a full salary, and an apartment provided by the company several blocks away from the penthouse. Elena opened the folder slowly and read the first page in silence. After a moment, she looked up at him with quiet surprise. Adrian explained that the role would allow her to leave the environment where rumors had begun while still building a future with the company if she chose to accept it. The room fell silent as Elena absorbed the offer. Finally, she asked a question that carried the same calm honesty he had come to expect from her. She asked whether the decision came from responsibility or from the desire to restore distance between them. Adrian did not answer immediately. After a few seconds, he admitted that both reasons were true. Elena studied his expression for a moment longer before closing the folder. Then she said something that shifted the entire conversation. She said she appreciated the opportunity and the respect behind it, but she believed every person eventually reached a moment when stepping away from a complicated story was not the same as understanding it. Adrian listened carefully, unsure where the thought would lead. Elena smiled gently and explained that she would accept the new position, not because she wanted to disappear from the situation, but because sometimes the best way to understand what something means is to see whether it continues to exist when circumstances change. With that, she thanked him quietly and left the office carrying the folder in her hands. Later that evening, Adrian stood once again beside the glass walls of the penthouse looking out at the endless lights of Manhattan. The decision he had made felt both responsible and strangely unfinished. Somewhere in the city, Elena Ward was beginning a new chapter that neither of them fully understood yet. Sometimes life does not offer simple endings, but instead invites us to grow through the choices we make when uncertainty appears. If this story reminded you that respect, courage, and honesty can change the direction of even the most controlled life, take a moment to support the channel by liking the video, subscribing for more quiet stories like this one, and sharing it with someone who might appreciate a reminder that the most meaningful connections often begin in the smallest and most unexpected moments.